Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the peculiar, wonderful Bates Mansion here in downtown Tucson. Hello, everybody here on Zoom. One of these days, come down, join us here in the Bates Mansion. It's funky, it's weird, it's cool, it's eclectic, and it's quintessential archaeology Southwest and historic preservation and all of the rest of that kind of stuff. Before I introduce the speaker, a couple of things. I want to, of course, recognize the Smith Family Trust and BMO Bank for sponsoring the Archaeology Cafe series, so please give them a round of applause. And then also we're blessed by Archaeology Cafe royalty in the room tonight because Linda Pierce, the former deputy director here, is back there. And she and Bill Doley got this whole program going in what year? How long has it been?
You have to ask Kate.
Kate couldn't make it tonight, but it's been 2 decades. I did one of these in 2014, and this thing was well established by then. So thank you for getting Archaeology Cafe up and rolling those many years ago and keeping it going for all of this time. All right, we're in for a special treat tonight, folks, because preservation anthropologist Aaron Wright, who is the undeniably, I think, the world's expert on rock imagery of southwestern Arizona and much of the southern Southwest, but also trails and other archaeological manifestations in a landscape that frankly doesn't get a lot of attention because it's really tough to work in amongst other things. But I've had the joy of being able to go out into the field with Aaron just a couple of times, and all it does is get me more excited about spending more time in the field with him because he really, really knows his stuff, and it's driven by a preservation ethic, a holistic approach to anthropology and archaeology that embodies all of the wonderful things that Archaeology Southwest does. Aaron is from Ohio originally, was a preservation fellow here many years ago, and has been employed here for the last 19 years. So the title of his talk is up here, Following Their Footsteps, Indigenous Geography in the Anza Expedition of 1775, 1776. Aaron, Dr. Wright, you want to take it away?
Okay.
Cool. Aaron Wright,
Awesome.
everybody.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome. Hello, Tucson friends, folks in Zoom land. It's great to be here tonight. As Sarah mentioned, this is a lecture in coordination with the Anza 250 commemoration, which is a program through the National Park Service, because the Juan Bautista Anza Trail is a National Historic Trail. And they have a website if you want to see more programming, but I just want to say that I'm humbled and honored to have been selected to basically represent that program through this lecture series. And so let's get started. The Juan Bautista de Anza National Historic Trail, here's a map. It basically commemorates, celebrates 1,200 miles of an 1,800-mile expedition from Culiacan in Sinaloa, Mexico, to the San Francisco Bay Area. The National Historic Trail is 1,200 miles because it's only the section inside the United States. That expedition took about 5 months to reach the Bay of Monterey and then a few more months to reach San Francisco. And this expedition had over 200 people, approximately 240 people, mostly soldiers and settlers from northwest New Spain at that time. They had mixed racial and ethnic identities, a lot of mestizos and Afro-Latino persons. The average age was 17. One person passed away on the expedition, but 3 people were born, so they ended up with more than who left. It was led by Juan Bautista de Anza, who was the military official at the Presidio in Tubac, and he was accompanied by 3 Franciscan priests. Francisco Garces, who was at San Javier del Bac, Pedro Font, who was working at the mission of San Jose, which is east of Hermosillo in Sonora, and then Thomas Eihart, who was stationed at Tumacacori. And they had indigenous guides. We don't know much about them. They're not really referenced well. Various laborers and staff, and then 1,000 head of cattle. Wow. And yeah, it's huge group. And you would think that they would leave an impression on the landscape, right? And prior expeditions through here were small groups of people. And so this was a colonizing expedition with the intent of putting a colony at San Francisco Bay. And so the Park Service, by designating a National Historic Trail, what they want to do is they want to commemorate the colonizing expedition, of course, the founding of an overland route to the Pacific coast from Sonora, and the Spanish settlement of Alta California at large, and then the cultural diversity of both the entourage, the assembly of folks, the colonizing party, if you will, as well as the indigenous communities through which they passed. And so I'm going to be emphasizing that indigenous element in my lecture tonight, and it's maybe not a coincidence. This also dovetails with Native American Heritage Month. Okay, this National Historic Trail was established in 1990 through a legislative act signed by President George H.W. Bush. It is administered by the National Park Service, and it's managed in partnership with the landowners and agencies, nonprofits that are associated with the trail, including the Anza Trail Foundation, who is one of our sponsors this evening. And in the law, the purpose recognized in the law that established this is for the identification and protection of the route, as well as the remnants of that route, for the recreational use and historical interest. And that is effectively how the Park Service manages and promotes this National Historic Trail. And so there is an official auto route that you can drive that approximates the general course. There are hiking trails and various and sundry recreational activities associated with it. The Park Service has put in these numerous wayside exhibits at points of interest, including several of the campsites. And there is some degree of tourism associated with it. This perhaps being the most iconic, of course. And so that's how the Park Service grounds the Anza narrative, what I call grounding it. And I'm going to return to that concept of grounding it in a little bit. And so the point of this presentation tonight is really to underscore what I believe is the foundation of the Anza expedition. It's the indigenous wisdom, knowledge, and infrastructure that made that expedition possible, what I call indigenous geography. Before I get to that, we need to contextualize this expedition. So there's a little bit of a history lesson. And so we have to think it's the mid-18th century and what's going on. Essentially, Northwest North America is unclaimed territory. Spain had claimed it in 1542. Britain had claimed it in 1579, but there was not a presence there to really solidify those claims. Big things happened in 1763. The French and Indian War had concluded. Britain had received most of the land that France had in the New World. Spain had expanded their reach up the coast, but they still had not settled it or colonized it. And then we moved to 1767, and the big event of this era is the expulsion of the Jesuits from the New World. King Carlos III of Spain removed them, had them removed, and replaced them with the Franciscans. And so in light of these geopolitics going on, Britain's pressing west from their territories, Russia's coming down from the Arctic and exploring the Pacific coast. Carlos makes the decision that we really need to settle the Alta California. We need to put people there to solidify our claim, and essentially act as a defensive buffer against their larger settlements to the south. This is the distribution of missions at that time. And circled here, and this is a map of that period. Basically, the nation, the peoples of this land are unknown. They had not explored it. They didn't know what to encounter. This was terra incognita in 1767. And so the king put in place the Franciscans, who were led by Junipero Serra, and he was accompanied by Gaspar de Portola, a military commander who was assigned, put in place as the governor of the province of Las Californias. And on the expedition north in 1769 to settle San Diego, the first mission, Portola continued north and essentially discovered the San Francisco Bay, looking for the Bay of Monterey. So it became a key port that Spain wanted to settle. And in those intervening years, they established 5 missions along the Pacific coast. And so that takes us to 1772, 1773. And that's where a gentleman named Sebastian Tarrabal comes onto the scene. Now, he's an indigenous person. We don't know much about him from the historical record. We are led to believe that he was a Cochimi from Baja California. It's possible he was a Cocopah person from Baja California. But essentially, he was conscripted into the mission system, the Spanish mission system, at some point in the 1760s. There's a marriage record of him in 1767 from one of the missions. By 1773, he's at San Gabriel, and he's evidently not liking it because he attempts to flee. And rather than taking the Camino Real down the Pacific coast, evidently because he didn't want to get caught, he traveled inland, so that would be to the east, into the deserts. He was accompanied by his wife and a male companion. The wife and the male companion did not make it. They presumably passed away through the Utah Desert. Tarabal survived and made it to the Quetzal communities on the Colorado River. The Quetzal were aware that the Spaniards were looking for an overland route, and Tarabal had just made that overland route. And so the Quetzal realized how valuable Tarabal was to the Spaniards. So they took him to Anza. Now, the fact that Anza had met a person who had made that overland route was enough to convince King Carlos to sponsor that overland expedition. And so that first expedition was in 1774. The Anza expedition, the one that's recognized as 75 to 76, this was the precursor, this exploratory expedition. Anza, Father Garces, Father Diaz, Tarabal, of course, and 34 soldiers. And they essentially retraced Tarabal's route to San Gabriel over the Camino del Diablo, up to Monterey, turned around and headed back to Tubac. On the return route, you might have noticed they took a slightly different route. They followed the Gila River on the return. And so that route approximates the route they took the next year, of course, which is the recognized National Historic Trail. So I wanted to look at the cultural diversity of the communities through which they passed. And so this is simply a time lapse of all of those. These are the indigenous communities that were inhabiting those lands at the time of the Anza expedition. And you can see there's a great, considerable cultural diversity that these folks passed through. This was not a depopulated area. It was full of communities. And they represented 3 language groups. So you can see how indigenous guides were going to be essential to this expedition. Now, the expedition started in Sonora, so that's Uda Aztecan-speaking country. I suspect that Tarabal was a bridge between the Uda Aztecan and the Penutian, because Tarabal had spent time in the missions on the Pacific coast where he'd been in contact with Penutian speakers. It's just a hypothesis. There's a close-up of that route in southern Arizona, which is going to be the focus here. Now, archaeologists have known that indigenous communities traveled widely, right? We see it in the material culture. Really good example was the shell exchange, right? We've got shell from the Pacific coast, Sea of Cortez showing up far inland, right? And so we have ideas of how it moved around. Was it down the line trade? Was it direct couriers? People illustrated what some of us believe are traveling merchants on their pottery. So long distance exchange and economy, we understand it as archaeologists. Now, there's also ethnography that we can think of in terms of broad scale, extreme distance movement. And I see it in the song cycles. And the song cycles that indigenous communities have. Here are 2 examples from the work that I do. One is the one at left is the basically several songs of the O'odham communities. And the one at right is the salt song for the Chemehuevi in the Las Vegas area. And so you can see just how much land is covered by these salt songs. And these songs are sequences, and embedded in those songs are places and place names. And so by putting them together, they basically create maps. They're narrative maps, and they're sacred maps. And so many of the songs are sacred. And I think perhaps one of the best examples, or the clearest examples for me, of how the Spaniards capitalized on that knowledge, that indigenous knowledge of vast landscapes beyond what I could comprehend, comes from Kino's work. And here's one of Kino's maps. This is a map from 1696. And Kino had only been to the Casa Grande by that point in time. So how did he know about the rest of the Gila River? Where did he get information to populate this map? Well, he interviewed Opa and Coco Maricopa's peoples, who are Pipash. He interviewed them while he was at the Casa Grande. And so they had to have told him that. They had to have shared that information. So they were able to share geographically correct information about 120 miles west of the Casa Grande. So how does this relate to the Anza expedition? Well, we talked about indigenous guides. Tarball is our best known case. We can think about indigenous commodities. In the writings of the Anza expedition, left by Anza, Font, Garces, and Ihart to some extent, we know that they loaded up on beads and tobacco before they set out. They used the beads and tobacco to persuade people along the route, perhaps to pacify individuals who didn't like them coming into their territory, etc. So anyway, they were cognizant of what the indigenous communities wanted and valued, and so they tapped into that. They exploited that economy for their own purposes. And now what I'm focusing on with the remainder of my lecture is the infrastructure. And my goal is to show you, ideally convince you, that the Anza expedition followed indigenous trails. Now, when the National Historic Trail was designated, they relied solely on the historical record, the diaries of the expedition, to identify the route. So it's an approximate route. And I've been wondering for quite some time, why wouldn't there be indigenous trails somewhere that you could see and follow? We had 1,000 head of cattle, 250 people approximately. That's a huge impression on the landscape. So we started looking. So we can look at the narrative first. Let's set the context here. This is my first case study. This is from the Great Bend of the Gila. And what's illustrated here is what I call the cutoff of the Great Bend of the Gila. If you're familiar with the area, Highway 238 from Maricopa to Gila Bend, the Sonoran Desert National Monument. Park Service recognizes the yellow streak as the corridor. And so in the journals, we know that the party started at basically Maricopa wells, which wasn't established at the time. There were wells there. They called them Las Lagunas de Hospital. The first day they stopped at a dry wash, which most of us agree is the west prong of Waterman Wash, pointed out here. That is the halfway point across the Great Bend of the Gila cutoff. They passed through a mountain pass they called the Puerto de los Coco Maricopas, which is the pass of the Peeposh, and that essentially signals they were aware that they were moving from O'odham communities and territories into human or Peeposh territory. And then they ended at essentially Gila Bend, Uaput Oidag. Now that's the historical record. I always wondered, did they really go through that pass that the Park Service felt they did, which is essentially the pass that the historic wagon road goes through? Or wouldn't they go through the other pass that the railroad and the current road goes through, right? I'll return to that. So this is the terrain of the Maricopa Mountains. It's a dissected landscape, rugged. Most of the ground surfaces are of Holocene age, so there's not very much desert pavement that would preserve trails. And so we're really unlikely to see indigenous trails in this landscape. So I'm going to go back to a project I started. This is the beginning of my case study in 2018. I did a survey of roads in the Sonoran Desert National Monument. The whole purpose was to see, are these roads impacting important cultural resources in the monument, right? So we didn't have any sort of forethought looking for trails or anything. I'm going to focus on these two roads here, starting with this one. Well, we began to find pottery sherds, right? If you're doing an archaeological survey, of course, you're going to find pottery sherds, but most of the landscape that we walked didn't have anything. It was actually pretty depressing, the small amount of material we did find. But we did start finding these interesting linear alignments of pottery sherds, right? Starting here. And these are artifact scatters, predominantly pottery, high percentage of buffware, and most of them are jar forms. And so I was thinking about it. These are probably artifact alignments associated with trails that we can't see. The trails don't preserve on the ground surface, but maybe the debris that's associated with the trails does. And so we found another one near the mountain pass. And as we were working west, we started finding impressions in the landscape, so actual footpaths in the desert pavement closer to the river, which I've illustrated here dashed. These had actually been previously recorded. The folks that recorded that were working east into the mountains, and they stopped where the trail ended. Like, well, there's no more trail, we can't follow it. We were following artifacts from the other direction, and we brought it together. So when we zoom out and we look at that, okay, maybe we're identifying trail systems through the mountains, correct? Now this project, it was a road survey, so we couldn't really work far outside of the road right-of-ways. And so we returned a couple of years later. We wanted to know what happens if we just keep flagging pottery sherds? How far can we go? And so I called that the Comox Trail Survey. This was sponsored by the Gila River Indian community because they were impressed with what we had found so far, and presumably I still think that we were finding an ancient trail that connected a village on the Gila River Indian community at Comox at the far right with the lower Gila, the Gila Bend Basin region. And this is what happened. And so this was eye-opener, right? And so we had developed a methodology to identify indigenous trails when you don't have trails, just by looking at the pottery sherds. There's about 12,000 pottery sherds illustrated here. So on that road survey, we also found two similar alignments to the south there, which I've highlighted. As you can see, one of them falls within the corridor of the Juan Bautista to Anza trail. Somebody asked, well, can we replicate it? Can we do it down there and see what happens? Well, I have a time lapse of that. And so we got a grant from the Bureau of Land Management to investigate that question. And so each blip is about a mile. We were able to do about a mile a day, and we just kept doing it. Wow. And it just kept growing. And it just kept eating up our budget. But we couldn't stop. It was so addictive. I know some of the folks here have had the pleasure of working on this project. So this is as far as we got. We have a little bit more work to do. But as you can see, it's a complex trail network through the mountains here. And so we do have an indigenous trail passing through the Maricopa Divide here to the south, following the modern road. And we have another one going through the historical road. So it's not an either or, it's both. And if we project these out, the one on the lower end, if you draw a straight line, it goes to basically Akchen. And these ones go to either Sackatone, if you keep going, but essentially around the southern end of the Sierra Estrella, presumably to Maricopa Wells. And there's about 50,000 sherds on this map right here.
What's the width?
The width of, it depends. So I'm going to get into that right here. So you can see we've got a fork, right? So which one did they take? The Park Service, remember the Park Service is just working off of notes and papers, and so maybe it's a random guess that they picked that one. Well, there's a way to answer that. So we were inventorying the pot sherds. We were also evaluating what wares they were, so very basic archaeology. Are we dealing with buff wares and plain wares? So we have all of that data, but to simplify this presentation, really just address the question, which of these did the Anza party follow? Well, if they had indigenous guides, they were probably being led over trails by the indigenous communities that they were interacting with at that time, which were A'atum groups, right? So A'atum persons. These potsherds include a combination of A'atum ceramics and Hohokam ceramics. And we're able to distinguish them on the survey. So here's some examples. We've got the red on buff at the bottom. And then at the top, we've got some examples of some decorated A'atum ceramics. But as you can see, there's visual differences, there are technological differences that allow us to attribute ceramics to one of the two periods. These aren't necessarily different cultural groups, they're different periods. And so when we plot those, you can see there's a lot of black ones on the bottom, which are A'atum, and red ones at the top. So we actually have some horizontal trail stratigraphy, is what us desert archaeologists refer to, where one trail is younger than the other and vice versa, predominantly. And so back to this gentleman's question about how wide they are. An important thing to notice is that the one with the Hohokam pottery is very narrow. And so that sherd corridor, I would say on average is 30 meters. You can see the one with predominantly A'atum ceramics is much wider. You can also see that there's a lot more on the Hohokam alignment than the A'atum. And I believe that's probably just because of the duration of use. So the Hohokam trail has ceramics from the Snaketown period up through A'atum. There are some A'atum ceramics. So you're looking at maybe 1,300 years of deposition. Whereas opposed to the one that's predominantly autumn ceramics, those are going to be potteries made for maybe 200-300 year period, right? So just not used as long. Now the width, interesting observation. If you're on a caravan, if you're using wagons and horses and steeds, you're probably spread out a little wider, just like the Anza expedition was. So I'm not insinuating that all these potsherds were dropped by the Anza expedition, not at all. However, in the historical period, that's when folks were using wagons. And so these are, in autumn ceramics were made and used up into the early 20th century. And so I think that partly answers what you just asked. And so when we zoom out and we look at this, again, at that larger scale, integrated trail network, system of trails through and across the Great Bend of the Gila. And it really reemphasizes that integrated network of trails and geographies that are embedded in things such as indigenous song cycles. Now, my second case study is just from down the river, squarely in Peeposh country, the nation of the Coco-Maricopas. And so let's go back to the journals, right? The Anza expedition gives us information about the route. Starting at Uapadioidag, on the 11th they left, they reached Opa villages. The next day they stayed at Rancheria de San Diego. They passed through the Painted Rock Mountains to reach Aridoc. And then they reached Agua Caliente the next day. Now we have a pretty good idea of where Agua Caliente is, Uapadioidag. Now, Ali Kelly Doag, or Aridoc, is interesting. And so this area right here was the focus of my Lower Gila River ethnographic and archaeological project a couple of years back. Lots and lots of data and information. And while working on that, I just thought, well, if the Anza party came through here, then we should be able to find the places they reference, including the villages. And so let's just use what they wrote. They traveled 1 league, and let's measure it. They traveled 1 league southwest. Then they traveled 3 leagues to the west, where they reached a place called La Rinconada. Anza called it La Rinconada, corner in Spanish. Prior to reaching La Rinconada, they crossed the Gila River a quarter of a league back.
How far is a league?
It depends on who you're talking to, what time, what period, but think about 2 miles, 2.5 miles. And so it looks like we can identify where La Rinconada is just simply based on the measurements they provided. And then the geography, as you can see from the topographic relief, there is a geological corner here, right? And so La Rinconada is what Anza called it. The others refer to it as Aridoc, the village name, Aridoc. Now this is a Peeposh village. The name is an O'odham term because the guides were O'odham speakers, and so they named the villages O'odham names, even though they weren't O'odham villages per se. Now, Aridoc is the Spanish attempt to pronounce Ali Doag, or Ali Kelly Doag, which is in reference to that mountain right there. In the O'odham tongue, in place names, Ali Kelly Doag is Oatman Mountain. And here's an aerial view of Oatman Mountain to the right. And then you can see the horizon, there's a basalt flow. So that creates that corner. That's the La Rinconada. You can see the Gila River juxtaposed there. And so while surveying in this area on that project, and with the permission of the private landowner, as you can see, there's a farm here, we found an ancestral village on the edge of the riverbank, one of about 40 ancestral villages we found out here. This one was different than a lot of the others. It had artifacts that did not fit most of the pattern. Basically, we found relatively recent artifacts, ceramics and lithic artifacts that suggest basically a historic period occupation, right? So this is post-Hohokam. And so folks coming through here in the historical period may have interacted with the folks living here. What I'm getting at is I think we stumbled upon what remains of Aridoc, the village of Aridoc. Now we had the fortune of also finding this ceramic pipe, and with the landowner's permission and with consultation with the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, we were able to radiocarbon date this pipe, the soot inside the pipe, And we got a date of 1675 to 1830 at 95% confidence. So we're pretty sure that this village was, people were living in it during the period of the Franciscans, so that's the Anza expedition, but probably also Kino who came through in 1699. And Kino's map, the one I showed earlier, has a village on there. You've never been to it, Arigo Dog. And so evidently Kino had been here, Kino had been here on his 1699 visit as well. And so with that information, we've grounded where Ali Kelly Doag is, or Ari Doag. We've grounded that community. Can we track the trail from there? So let's go back to the journals. They marched towards the southwest, climbing a stony mesa for about a league before they descended to the river. So that's that region right there. You can see the Park Service did a really good job of approximating that location. I mean, the journals, this is one of the clearest areas of the journal. These are the indigenous trails that we mapped in our project area. I haven't counted up all the lengths, but there's well over 100 miles. But you can see this is a trail network. Now, these are ones you can actually see on the ground surface, right? And they're so emblazoned in the ground surface, you can actually trace them in aerial photographs. That's not what we did. We actually mapped them on the ground. I'm going to focus on the one on the north side because that's presumably where the Anza party went. And as you can see, it's a complex network. But what stands out is that corridor across the north. That is the sole corridor that extends for about a league across the stony mesa before it descends to the river. All the others are essentially, you can conceptualize them as perhaps driveways. They lead down to the river where there are little village communities. So it's basically a road network, and here's what that looks like from the air. Hard to miss, hard to confuse it for anything else. And what's really impressive is how many there are. So when you think about the narrow one that the gentleman brought up previously, and then you can think about the previous graphic that all the other trails were single alignments, that's the typical indigenous trail route that you're going to find. Sometimes you'll find 2, maybe 3 corridors. But for large expeditions, they would have obviously spread out. And so the corridor here being 5, in some places 6 trail alignments together, really reifies that there were large parties of people and animals traveling across this conduit. Now, I don't think the Anza expedition created this wide trail thing. I believe they used it, but we know that they didn't create it because there's plenty of earlier, quote unquote, prehistoric ceramics all along it. So it is an older trail network. Now, why would folks prior to steeds and armies, if you will, need such a wide trail network? Well, we know that the lower Gila River facilitated large groups of people. Simply from the historical record, we know that there were war parties moving both ways from Quetzal territory to O'odham territory. Hundreds of warriors would march up and down the Gila River, probably taking this highway. There's also what I refer to as the Peeposh diaspora. So in the early 1800s, large groups of people moved from the Colorado River to the Gila River near Sackatoon and Maricopa Wells. They probably took this highway because it could accommodate them. And I was flipping through a magazine a few years ago and I saw this and it just reminded me of that field work. This is a group of Ethiopian migrants in the desert, and you can just see how the trails form when you're marching in a group as opposed to single persons or small families. So back to the archaeology of this. What I find confusing about the journals of the Anza expedition and other Spanish chroniclers of this period is that they don't mention the archaeology and principally the rock imagery and the other rock features that literally litter these trails. And so this plateau, this stony mesa that they were following has petroglyphs all along it. It has rock pile shrines, geoglyphs, basically various and sundry forms of, for lack of a better word, shrines that we know are sacred and significant to the indigenous communities of the era. And so why didn't they remark on them? I can only speculate, but I suspect it had something to do with the fact that these are representations of indigenous religion, and these were colonizing, Christianizing expeditions. And so there was some sort of interplay of faith or conflicts of faith that I think plays out in the narrative by not being in the narrative. if that makes sense. Now, was it the other way around? Did the indigenous peoples record the Spaniards that came through? I think they did, and I have two examples. The first one, near Agua Caliente, we inventoried this petroglyph panel. I've got some close-ups here in a second. At the left is a scene of the crucifixion of Christ. And to the left of that is an earlier, or not an earlier, smaller, less well-made example, perhaps a practice one. For the one that's obvious and clear, you can see there's an inverted, basically lunar symbol above it. So we have the fusion of Christian iconography and ideology with indigenous iconography and presumably ideology. So we see a hybrid form of rock imagery conveying religious concepts and precepts from two traditions. To the right of that panel, we've got this face figure, right? And these other petroglyphs. Notice that the rock varnish is pretty much the same. The amount of pecking, the intensity of pecking, the style of pecking is roughly the same amongst these elements. And so it seems to me that they're roughly made at the same time, using the same technology, presumably by the same people. Now, what's compelling about the face is that we don't see face petroglyphs in southern Arizona rock imagery until the historical period. I don't know why, but generally it doesn't show up. And for most iconographic traditions of the Southwest, we don't see faces. Membrace is one exception, of course. On this face is this helmet. I believe this is a Morion helmet, which is diagnostic of the 17th century. And so I'm convinced that this is a portrait of a Spanish military person. The reason I don't think it's from the Anza expedition is because by that time they weren't wearing these styles of helmet. This style of helmet, as I said, was really only used in the 16th and 17th centuries. So who could it be? Well, in reviewing the historical records, the only Spanish military person that's recorded being anywhere on the lower Gila River was Monje, who accompanied Kino. And so is this a portrait of Monje, Lieutenant Monje? It's worth thinking about. Now, the second example I have is from the well-known Painted Rock Petroglyph site, and we've probably all seen this if you've been to the site. Clearly a person on horseback. What are they holding, right? I suspect that that is a Spanish pike and or flag standard. And so those are the sort of accoutrements that the Anza expedition would have had as a formal sanctioned expedition with a large group of people. And so this may well be an indigenous depiction or record of the Anza expedition. And with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation tonight, and I want to thank everyone for coming. I welcome questions. Give them to me.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That was so wonderful. So I have a microphone, and if you raise your hand, I'll come bring it to you, and you can ask your question.
Thank you for a really fun talk. Just a minor comment. I think it's natural people braid their trails. I mean, we see it happen all the time today. You know, braiding happens.
Thank you.
Any other?
So Chris Bentley told me to ask you this question.
Okay.
Like, I guess it's a basic question, and I probably just don't know because I'm not knowledgeable, but they're all shards along the trail. We don't see whole pods. And is there a cultural reason behind that? Maybe my friend can answer, but yeah.
So why are they just pot shards?
Yeah, why are they broken all? Why aren't there whole pods?
So I can't answer exactly and specifically. I have ideas, and I'll share with you some of my ideas. I believe some of them are broken pots, so the things that were dropped either intentionally or accidentally and broken in place. And the reason I will say I know that is because we have cases where you have pretty much all the sherds of one pot in a little cluster. Those are generally the autumn vessels because they've only been broken for a couple of centuries. So they're clustered and they're big sherds, and there's a lot of them. And I haven't glued them all back together, but there's most of a jar represented when you see it. So you've got that fact. But there's also could be offerings. So we know that based on other research and other contexts, indigenous communities put offerings at shrines along trails. And excavations have suggested that people have excavated some of these shrines, that some of those sherds are offerings at the shrine. So you have that sort of behavior. So that's really the two. One thing to think about is they may also have been caching water. So what I maybe wasn't clear is this Great Bend of the Gila Cutoff. Depending on where you're going, it's anywhere from 25 to 40 miles with no water. So you got to take water, which probably helps explain why there's so many pots. And if you're traveling 40 miles without water, when your pot's empty, why would you carry it any further? So maybe they've been deliberately doing that. Anyway, great question. That's the kind of stuff I think about out there when I'm flagging the pot sherds. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
The difference between sherds and shards, I once knew that, and you use sherds all the time. Am I right in thinking they are different? Shards and sherds?
Generally, a shard is in reference to glass.
Ah, really?
Yeah, but I don't think that there's really a technical difference. It's more of a jargon. So plenty of people call the pot sherds shards.
Okay.
And there's regional people from the east often say shards. So
All right.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I was
not an
wondering,
issue.
because I somewhere in my history of hearing about these things, I thought they were different. But how interesting that they only had sherds and no shards. Thank you.
I'll do you and then you.
Hi, thank you very much. Do you know or discern any connection between the picture rocks, petroglyphs, the Tucson Mountains, and any of this stuff?
So the Picture Rock petroglyphs off of Picture Rocks Road.
Yeah.
So that's that petroglyph site is Gila style rock imagery, and so we would class it within that painted rock petroglyph site. There's stylistic similarities, and it's reasonable to think that someone may have made one in both places, but they're pretty far apart.
Yeah, there's no directionality happening, as far as these expeditions, you think, with those images?
Yeah, not that I'm
I don't know.
not that I'm aware, but I've not really thought about that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to ask the question that only a person who's not afraid of sounding naive would. Tomato, tomato, shard, Anza, Anza.
Okay, so I was schooled on this by a federal agent. It's if you don't have the first. This is what I was told. If you don't use the first name Juan, then you don't use the preposition. So it's Anza or Juan de Anza. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Makes sense after I was scolded.
What does Anza refer to?
That's a person's name. He was the military commander at the Presidio Tubac.
Often names are from the...
I don't know. That's a good question. I know he has obviously the same name as his father, and his father was from Spain. So, it could be a place in Spain. Yeah.
So do the records talk about the challenge of finding forage for 1,000 cattle? And I mean, the water
Yeah.
on the Gila isn't a problem, but your
Yeah.
long passages would be.
Absolutely. So where that village of Aridoac is, both the Spaniards and subsequent travelers, Euro-American, American travelers, often remarked on that place providing pasturage. And so it was evidently quite common for traveling parties to stay there for an extended period of time so that their cattle could eat. And it was described by the English writers, American writers, as basically being the only place you could do that on the lower Gila River. From Gila Bend to Yuma, it was the only place there was adequate forage for livestock. And in that survey area, there's lots of mule shoes, rusty mule shoes that look like they're 200-300 years old. So it evidently is the case. Yes, sir.
You spoke of the fact that they increased by 3 humans and lost 1.
Yeah.
How about the cattle? You
good.
said there were 1,000
Mm-hmm.
dead.
Yeah.
How many do you know how many
I don't.
arrived in 17?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if anyone does. That's an interesting question. I don't know if that was ever recorded.
Because you'd think you'd have to eat some of them.
Right,
but
that-
they will also procreate on the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely consume them along the route, but obviously they'd want a stock when they got there. So that's a good question.
Could you repeat that question for our online audience?
Yeah, the question was, do we know how many of the cattle survived the expedition? Did they end up in larger numbers than what set out? And I've never heard anyone even broach that subject, so I can't answer it. I can't provide any sort of insight. Yeah.
So there's areas where the trail is clear ground.
Yeah.
And there's areas where it's not.
Mhm.
Can you, maybe you did explain, but the differences between why in those two areas, and then also the areas where it is clear, just from a basic like landscape point of view, how did it last for so many hundreds of years and still remain clear?
Yeah, so where the trails are clear are on surfaces that we call desert pavement. So it's a specific geological surface that does not accumulate much sedimentation and essentially rocky surfaces. The parent rock can be various things. Here we have a lava flow, so the top of the lava flow. You find them in alluvial contexts as well, basically Pleistocene cobble bars and things like that. So essentially they're deposition, well, they're environments that aren't subject to rapid deposition. So they just sit out there, and any sort of disturbance is preserved for centuries and millennia. And so there are impressions like trails that preserve, and then there are also things like ground figures, intaglios. I don't know if you've heard of those, but basically creative works, designs, if you will, embedded into the ground surface or placed. And so it's a unique archaeological context that's characteristic of this area and Southeast California. But once you get off of those settings where you get into younger landforms, essentially, or landforms that are subject to more rapid deposition, like the one case study where I couldn't see the trails. So all of that alluvium, that sedimentation is basically Holocene age, so the last 9,000 years. The desert pavements are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years old. So does that make that answer? Okay.
Have you made this presentation, or are you planning to make the presentation to any native communities that were involved in these trails?
That's a great question. I'd love to.
Not yet, though.
No, not yet.
I have a question about the songs as an oral geography or a map. How are those songs documented? Is it through oral histories, or how do you get the data on those?
So what I know now, I'm not a community member, and so I only know what's been shared with me and what I've read. There are definitely song traditions that are still alive, and they're shared and passed on. There are recordings from the early 20th century during the salvage ethnography period, where ethnographers were going out and basically recording everything they could. So they're actually audio recordings in various and sundry museums and archives across the country that have kind of been ignored for quite some time, but they're there, and they're very, very informative. And so those are the two general places where we have access to that information.
How have those been translated into English?
How many, or how have they?
How have they been?
Well, there are ethnographers, colleagues, if you will, who do that. They work with native speakers of the communities, and it's serious work, and it's not as easy. I get the impression it's not as easy as you'd think it would be. Yeah.
Back to the question of native forage or native supplying forage. 100 years after Anza, I remember the 49ers going through that same area and starving and thirsting to death, and finally reaching one of the villages that was famous for being the Good Samaritans of the trail, because they'd come out and rescue these people and feed them and water them and show them where they could get food for their animals. And later on, they were also, during the Civil War, providing cut hay for the American Army. So, there was a lot going on, and these folks could see that it would help them to help other people, because obviously. And I think the Army stiffed them on one of the bills for the hay, one of those stories.
Probably.
But, do you remember specifically that area?
You're probably thinking the Middle Gila River Valley. So what today is the Gila River Indian Community and upriver of that. It is a really bountiful area, and those communities were supplying the military and wagon trains with melons, wheat, all sorts of crops. So I'm pretty sure that's what you're referencing. But essentially, that was the last place you could provision before you reached the Colorado River. And so wagon trains would stop at Maricopa Wells and basically gather supplies from the Akimelat and the Peepash people before making the rest of that trip. James Audubon called on his trip, and I think it was 1850, he called the Lower Gila River the River of Despair. So yeah, he didn't have a good time, I guess.
So we have a few questions from our online audience that I'd like to ask. We've been talking a little bit about sherds versus shards and the artifacts that you've found, but have you ever found any other types of artifacts, such as baskets? And they asked then, would those baskets have lasted? Would they have coated them in pitch? So several questions about baskets.
It's a great question. We've not found any basket pieces. We wouldn't expect that in that environment, but there are other types of artifacts. There are lithic artifacts, for example. There are some groundstone implements. We have not found a complete groundstone implement. They've all been broken. I don't know why you'd have a broken groundstone implement on a trail, but it happens. We found a pendant one time. And then importantly, every now and then we find fragments of shell. And so these trails were probably used in that shell economy that I referenced archaeologically. And so folks would pilgrimage to the Gulf of California, collect shell, and take them back to their communities. We presume they did the same thing with salt. Salt's not going to preserve, but we know that the Aut and peoples traveled these trails to gather salt as well from the Gulf of California.
Thank you. And then to kind of follow up on some preservation questions, we have one here about if people are out on our public lands and they come across petroglyphs or pottery and they think it might be in reference to a trail or to even the Spanish imagery that you mentioned, what do you recommend that they do, and who should they get in touch with?
Well, they should leave it there. Don't even if you're tempted, don't take it. Don't move the petroglyphs. Don't add to the petroglyphs. Don't walk on the trail alignments when you see them. Stay off of them. And if you're really moved, you can contact the landowner and let them know what you've identified. That's probably the most responsible thing to do. And generally, the landowners are aware, but they do appreciate the public's concern and interest in these resources. But they're the ones that are going to have the basically the right and the awareness of what to do, because each specific context is unique. Of course, for example, think, okay, here's a potsherd. Those there's lots of them. I love them all, but they're not necessarily exceptional. But if you found like a Morion helmet, the land agency may want to do something about that to protect that thing from being picked up by someone else. So,
great, thank you. And then one further question about, you mentioned volunteer opportunities. Do you have any opportunities coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. You can see on this slide is a list of all the volunteers that have participated so far, actively taking volunteers. There's a number of volunteers in the room tonight. I love working with the volunteers. We can't do this work without it. We've mapped upwards of 100 on the Sonoran Desert Monument, about 80 miles of trail, and I can't do that by myself. So the more eyes we have, the more potsherds we can find, the more ground we cover. So if you're interested in volunteering, reach out, get in touch with Sarah. You can get in touch with me directly if you have my contact. Basically, we work from through the winter and spring, so we're actually gearing up to start this work again here probably in December.
Great, thank you. With that, I think we're going to we're gonna end, but you feel free to mingle and chat with Aaron afterwards. We just want to keep it on time. It's about 7 o'clock. So we really greatly appreciate you all being here. Thank you so much, Aaron, and have a great night.
Thank you.